Hail, and welcome back to my channel. So, today we will be discussing a video on vampirism and vampires. Um, what drives Howling Wolf, who is normally a individual who strongly focuses on Germanic and Norse metaphysical topics, to make a video on vampirism and vampires? He does not seem particularly vampiric or like a vampire to most of you, most likely. And you would most probably be right. However, a couple months ago, I approached several deities, some gods and goddesses of my choice, with an offer. I made a contract with some of these beings, which I favor working with. I shall not name any names for their privacy and mine, and because frankly it's none of your business, no offense. Um, but in payment, these gods and goddesses asked me to do a video, or multiple videos, I should say, on various topics of their choice, and some on the topics of my choice. So some of the videos that I have recently been uploading, other than my older Fufar Rune divination videos, have been at the request of these deities, said deities that I work with, to achieve some goal, some end that I, again, will not be discussing with you guys, because it's, well, for personal matters. But basically, they asked of me, please make a video on this, and please make a video on that. And this is the other thing that I needed, or was requested to make a video on. I had, of course, the option to say no. I did not say no, as is evident by the existence of this video. So, to give you some context on why I think that they asked me to make this video, is because when I started engaging with the world of more quote-unquote intimately working with spirits, one of the first spirits that came to my side was a female vampire, a psychic vampire, from the 1500s, so the 16th century. Um, and she kind of instigated, along with another lady who was a sanguine vampire, and what these terms mean we will get into more later on in the video, obviously. Um, they kind of instigated a curiosity slash interest into working more in depth with vampiric energies, with vampiric magic, because I am, if you had not guessed yet from looking around my channel, a practitioner of the metaphysical arts. I am, as some would say, a shaman. Um, in some circles, it is not considered cool to call yourself a shaman. For those of you watching, I was identified by another shaman, and I am currently recognized as such by the group of people that I work with, if that satisfies your criteria. I am an eclectic shaman in the Germanic traditions. I was born and raised in the Netherlands. That is a country, tiny country west of Germany, in case you did not know. We are a Germanic people. We, way back in our history, before Christianity came along, worked with and walked alongside the Aesir and the Vanir, the Jotun, or the Asen and Vanen and the Jotun, as we would say in the Netherlands. We have different names for the same gods that you see in Norse mythology. Odin we call Wodan, Thor we call Donar, and so on and so forth. They are the same gods, just different names. And of course, the eclectic part means that I work with beings from pretty much the world over, and some even outside of this planet. I have no qualms working with beings from different areas in existence, shall we say. So, with that out of the way, I have recently, more recent times, I should say, as a result of my interaction with these two lovely vampire ladies, um, And yeah, this kind of snowballed as a result of my interaction with them, and I became more interested in working more closely with these energies. And I think that these deities, as is usually the case when they give assignments or tasks or favors that they ask in return for something I would like from them, they're, in my experience, very much interested in self-development, in researching and or having the individual that they are interacting with, I should say, research things and delve into these things. So as a result of that, I think that they may have picked up on that and decided to stimulate this interest. And with that said, now that little short introduction there on why I am making this video and what motivated me, with that out of the way, I have to say that most of the information that you will find in this video is not actually originally my own. I kind of like how I started my Fufark videos. Kind of feel that I am being asked to make these videos more for self-education, to motivate me to research, to motivate me to um, inquire, to ask questions, to delve into things head first, I should say, excuse me, and to develop certain aspects of myself that may have not been discovered, either that, or that may or may not just be an area of interest that will serve me on my path to well, self-development, to empowerment, apotheosis, whatever you want to call it. You get what I'm saying. Basically, I feel that these gods and goddesses, of course, meant to stimulate certain areas in me that may have lain dormant or that they feel that I have potential in or something like that. Now, again, as I stated before, I do not think that I am a vampire as such. I have never noticed myself draining energy from other people. I have never noticed a desire to taste blood, although I have no issues drawing my own blood or the blood of others for the purpose of ritual, willingly, of course, never involuntarily. So I don't think that that's exactly what it is, but it may just be that I have a perhaps hidden, latent, I don't know, potential there with working with vampiric energies, vampiric magic, I suppose. I do not think that that necessarily requires me to be a vampire as such. And of course, the question on what a vampire is shall also be answered later on in this video. So with that said, because as I mentioned, most of the information that I found here is mostly from my own relatively brief studies and delvings and readings into this topic, both online and in books. So we are, of course, going to throw out several well-known names in the vampire community, should you be already into that particular community, scene, whatever you wish to call it. So, of course, I drew a lot of information from the author Michel Bellinger, writer of the book, which I found very helpful, The Psychic Vampire Codex, for example. I drew a lot of information from Father Sebastian's vampireworld.com, if that is the right, yes, vampireworld.com, that is the right address. So these are, resources that you yourself can tap into as well. And of course, I'm just giving this background information in case you are someone who is new to this particular channel, which, I hope you find useful in helping yourself understand why someone like me would be willing and interested in delving into this topic, so that you just don't think I'm just some random wannabe fuckhead that decides to just, be pretentious, which is not the case. I was asked to do so, and as is usually the case when I'm asked something by deities that I like and who like me, I do it because, it's productive for myself, and hopefully it can be productive to some of you. So, with that said, with that credit given where credit is due, also, of course, to avoid plagiarism charges. But let's begin. The first question that I would like to answer, and again, from my own studies, from my own condensed research into this topic so far. That is, what is a vampire? Now, contrary to popular belief, when we think, of course, about the popular things that we see in media, like Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, movies like that, Twilight even, if you will, or Underworld or whatever, they are not beings who walk around with real fangs, although it is my understanding that individuals who identify as vampires or who are lifestylers, quote unquote, as they call it, people who are not actually identifying as vampires, but who engage with the image, with the archetype of the vampire, um, probably most often seen in the goth scene. I myself am an avid metalhead, so I am not really part of the goth subculture there, but I do have some experience through girlfriends, for example, that I've had in the past who were part of that particular lifestyle scene. So, what is a vampire? A vampire is simply someone who is a human being, just like you and I, who basically finds at some point in their life, some early on, some later on, that they have an increased need for psychic energy. Now, I use the term psychic energy as a general encompassing term because there are many different terms like chi, like ki, prana, stuff like that that you will find across the globe, basically, all refer to with different names, but they all refer to the same thing, the internal life force that each of us possess and that binds our spirits and on a higher level, in my personal opinion, in my personal belief system, the soul to the physical body. So basically what that means is a vampire has the ability and has the need, in fact, to tap into another person or perhaps animals. I have read in some cases life force, life energy, prana, chi, ki, whatever you wish to call it, aura, even to absorb that energy and take it for themselves in order to satiate a need, craving, if you will, if you wish to call it that. This is not to say that a vampire merely exists to feed off of the energy. It is not something that they, in my understanding, can help. It is not something that they, quote unquote, choose to do in that sense. It is more like, as I have been informed by spirits who are vampiric in nature that I work with, it could be considered similar to how a herbivore differentiates themselves from a carnivore. So if something is a herbivore, they strictly have a plant-based diet, and if something is a carnivore, that means that they are meat eaters, and that is something that they need in order to stay healthy, in order to stay sound of mind, sound of spirit in this case, sound in their energy, sound in their physical well-being. Now, as someone who walks the shamanic path, I very strongly understand the relation between mental health, spiritual health, and physical health, and the other way around. I very strongly adhere to the whole as above, so below, as within, so without, and the other way around, which is, something that is very obvious to me. Having walking the shamanic path means that I have, of course, encountered a shamanic illness, which in my case manifested strongly to the point of wanting to commit suicide in obsessive compulsive thoughts, OCD as we would call it. Again, I'm a student of psychology. It is not something that is unfamiliar to me in a, you know, from a scientific perspective. It is also very familiar to me intimately, unfortunately so, on a personal level. So I can attest to the effects that energetic imbalances, spiritual imbalances, have on the physical body. And of course, the brain is part of the physical body, although I personally, in my belief system, tend to think of the brain as a sort of a receiver for the energy that our spirit and perhaps the energies and beings and spirits around us also put out. So There's a whole different story, whole different ballgame attached to that shamanic illness principle that I discuss throughout my Elder Fufaric series mostly, because I have for the past 500 years been initiated, and I'm currently still being initiated into the Elder Fufaric runic system. Um, Due to certain things I have done in past lives across lifetimes, but that is neither here nor there. That is again just a bit of background information to make you hopefully see where I'm coming from, and to kind of reinforce and reassert that I have, I would say, a modest to good understanding of how energy works and why a vampiric being would have a quote unquote need for the prana or energy of another human being, or perhaps animal in some cases, I've heard. Basically, what happens if a awakened or unawakened vampire does not get their intake of nutrition, spiritual nutrition, energetic nutrition, they may end up developing spiritual illness, mental illness, physical illness, because again, everything is connected, and eventually, a spiritual, energetic imbalance may translate to a physical imbalance, and of course, the other way around as well. So they have an added need on top of what regular Joe Schmoes have. So that is to say, they do eat, they do drink, they piss, they shit, they sleep, they shower themselves. At least I would hope so. Um, they make love, they hate, they feel everything. They're, again, like I said, regular human beings just like you and I, and they simply have an added need that they need to fulfill on an energetic level in order to function and thrive. Now, I have personally thought of this as I was researching this, and I can't help but think that there must be some sort of perhaps genetic mutation, perhaps some sort of energetic trauma, maybe. Um, I haven't quite made up my mind about that. I am not saying there, by the way, that they are somehow lesser or damaged in that sense or anything of the sort. Because, if I thought such, then this video would have a very different tone to it, and I would not be so willing to work with individuals who, or spirits in my personal case, because I don't really currently interact with human beings who I would describe as living vampires. But in my shamanic work, I do interact with a lot of different spirits from all stripes and walks of life. So these happen to be a group to which I have, for some reason, gravitated. And that's basically what it comes down to. All the turning into bats, turning other people into vampires by biting them with fangs that vampires don't actually have, unless they choose to have their teeth, chiseled, or they choose to have sort of like a fake teeth set or whatever, because that is apparently a common thing I've read. Uh, all that stuff's bullshit. All right, it's not. It's not true. It's just not true. But what I have noticed in my inquiries and my research and stuff like that, from spirits and from what I've read online and in books and stuff, is that a lot of the times vampires do seem to have a strong affinity to the darker things in life, which is probably what attracts so many of them to, and has led them to become associated with the goth culture, for example. And so, in other words, real life vampires are not immortal, inhuman beings, stalkers and hunters of the night in that sense. Although, like many myths, there is usually some core or form of truth to that particular association. However, another thing that is oftentimes said about vampiric individuals is that they seem to be intuitively gifted in some way, shape, or form. And this is obviously most likely due to the energetic connections and ties that they far more readily and easily form to other beings. You will see things like empathy, or some sort of clair sense developing. I mean, it makes sense, right? if you have an increased need for energy and you consistently tap into the energy of others, whether that is unknowingly, as is the case for unawakened vampires, or knowingly, as is obviously more likely to be the case for an awakened vampire, as they call it, and more on that later, by the way, on those terms and what they mean. You are bound to become familiar with and establish an affinity for tapping into other people's energy, and as a result, recognizing patterns and energetic flows to them. So you will likely become more familiar with these patterns and over time learn to adapt and adjust and perceive all the things associated with such patterns. Which then brings me to the question, why do vampires feed off of the life force of those around them? Well, like I said earlier, it seems to be the case that it is merely an increased nutritional need. Whereas most human beings eat and drink and sleep and do all these things to nurture themselves, it seems to be merely an added requirement for them to stay healthy. It is often the case that you will see a vampire who does not feed off of the energy of others around them to supplement their own energy. That they become depressed, like I said, that they become weak, lethargic, and may even start developing mental and or physical illnesses, even spiritual. And that is, of course, a very nasty, bad thing. And if you were someone like this, you would also take action in order to have your needs, your cravings, your needs basically fulfilled. So, with that said, are there different kinds of vampires? And if so, what are they, or who are they? I will be giving you a non-exhaustive list that I have found through, well, research and personal interaction with various spirits mostly. Again, there has been a grand total of one individual that I have met in real life that fits the criteria of an of a vampire, and this individual would be my own mother. Now, I don't know if that by default would mean that I am one. Again, I have never noticed anything of the sort or have had any quote unquote complaints from people around me, from friends, from family, from acquaintances, that they get drained from being around me. So I'm going to assume that I am not one. However, logic to me would dictate that that is something of an inherited gene, perhaps. But more on that later. Um, so the first thing that we will be discussing, and as we have actually kind of already discussed, is the psychic vampire, or psi vampire for short. I would argue that due to the nature of vampirism, that it deals with subtle energies, that it deals with energetic feeding, that at its core, all forms of vampirism are psychic vampirism in the world that we live in. Even the individuals who identify themselves as sanguine vampires, aka the feeding on blood. Why do I say that? Because as a individual who walks the shamanic path, I am very strongly convinced of, and even physics supports this, that everything is energy. Everything is energy, everything is made up of energy. E is mc squared, etc., etc. Everything is energy, mass is energy, light is energy, you name it. So everything is made up of energy. We are made up of energy. We are energy. We do things and we exert our energy on the world around us. This is, of course, part of what the metaphysical teaches and has taught for as long as anyone remembers, really, that there are forces that influence the world in certain ways, in certain shapes, in certain forms. So when someone is a vampire and they feed off of energy, it seems to be the case, however, that particular substrains, if you will, for lack of a better term, of vampires seem to feed off of different kinds of energy. But even so, I stand by what I stated earlier. At its core, despite these subtle nuisances, every form of vampirism would, by default, therefore, be energetic or psychic vampirism in that sense. However, there are, as I said, psychic vampires who directly feed off of subtle energies, off of life force energies, perhaps, and how they do that and how that is acquired, and the many different levels of that we will be discussing later on. But then we, of course, have the sanguine vampire, as I mentioned earlier. The sanguine vampire is perhaps most close to the classical, uh, the classical vampire as we see them in, modern mythology, folklore, like Dracula, like all the movies that we have out nowadays. Uh, where vampires drink the blood of their victims to stay young, to stay healthy, to stay strong, practically immortal so long as they have access to a source of food, in which case this food source would be blood, of course. Now, from what I have read, again, many vampires who identify themselves as sanguine seem to state that there is an extra potent feeding that takes place when one feasts on blood. Now, I personally think that this may be because of the difference between a herbivore and a carnivore, and this was actually a metaphor that was proposed to me by one of the spirits that I interacted with. And I actually, after thinking it through, kind of agree with it. In fact, or at the very least, I think it is a very adequate way of describing it. Some people can be vegans. Some people have to have that meaty, grounding, earthy energy. Now, I myself have tried, I am a Pisces, I am a water sign. I have been told, a very high vibration. And besides, here I would like to interject real quick. A high vibration in my worldview does not equal being a better person than someone with a low vibration. It is merely what you resonate with on an energetic level. And that is not to say that someone with a low vibration is therefore good or evil. And that is also not to say that someone with a high vibration is good or evil by default. I have met, as I have stated in earlier videos, individuals who have a high vibration who are complete and utter jackasses. And I have met individuals with very low vibrations, such as my best friend, who have very low vibrations on the scale of where the average of human vibrations fall, in at least. So that is a comparison that I found interesting, and I think that it is a good comparison. I think it is a good description. I think that some of us, like I was going with these, where I was going with the story, as a Pisces and someone with a high vibration, I was told by someone, oh, you should try going pescatarian. I tried doing that for about a year and I felt ungrounded as fuck. I was actually hindered by it. I was hampered by it. Now, when I went back on meat, I initially felt really sluggish. But after a while, I started feeling much more healthy. I started feeling much more strong. I started feeling more empowered. I started feeling more like me again. I did not feel like I was floating halfway above my body at any given time, regardless of what I was doing. So it is my personal opinion that, and experience, I should say as well, that different folks have different strokes, as they say. So I think that this might very well be the case with a sanguine vampire versus a purely psychic vampire, where a sanguine vampire may simply need that grounding energy that blood provides. It is basically their carnivorous nature compared to a psychic vampire's herbivore nature, if you will. At the end of the day, it's both energy and it's both food. As you would compare a plant-based diet of a vegan It's still food, just like the meat eating of the carnivore is still food. It still sustains, it's still nutritious, people can survive on it, people do it without suffering withdrawals as long as you know what you're doing. So I think that that is a satisfactory and good separation and explanation. So we also have, or at least I've also heard of and interacted with spirits who gain their energy from different things like elemental energies, like water, for example, where it's kind of like an aqua energy, where it's like living off of water energy, or where they feed off of sexual energy. Um, the succubus or incubus for the male version would in some way, shape, or form qualify for this. I have had a spirit spouse, two of them actually, currently with one, but my previous succubus, who I have made a dedicated video on, she was a rather, yeah, she was a very a rapey, clingy individual. I have made, as I said, another video on that. Spirit Spouses Part 1, in case that interests you. It's on my channel, where I go in depth and at length on that particular topic. After she came to me and would interact with me in various intimate ways, shall we say, she always left me very drained, very tired, very sluggish, very yeah. In some cases, I would almost have said violated. So, and I don't use that word lightly. I have actually been raped by this particular spirit repeatedly, but that is a topic that kind of needs to be discussed, since we are discussing the topic of energy, vampirism, and stuff like that. So there do exist beings, including human beings, who get this energetic craving, energetic need fulfilled through sexual intercourse and contact. Now, this is a particular method of feeding that has a specific name. It goes to a specific depth, but we will discuss that later. There are those, and here's where my experience with my mother comes in, who seem to feed on certain emotions. My mom was someone who did not specifically feed on emotions, actually, I should say, but she fed very strongly on sickness and illness. She was someone who was constantly sick for as long as I can remember, and everybody around her, including my father, who was suicidal for his entire time with my mom until he eventually left her. I was constantly sick, my sister was constantly sick, and people who are around my mother for a prolonged period of time, they become sick. It is as if she generates it, manifests it, and then feeds off of it. Now, whether this means that my mom is I am, as you can probably tell, not on very good footing with my mother, but yeah, I am pretty sure, after having researched this, that my mom is a very, at least a very likely candidate, I should say, to being a vampire. Although she may perhaps, and I'm pretty sure actually, not perhaps, that she is an quote unquote unawakened individual. I don't think that she knows that she's doing it, but I do very strongly feel that she craves that energy and needs that energy. I have literally seen her manifest in hindsight, and what I know now of my interactions, from my interactions with the spiritual realms and with energies, that my mother manifests sickness in order to feed off of it, including in herself, which is of course a very tragic, tragic thing to have happen to oneself. It seems almost as if she cannibalizes herself on on her lack of feeding partners, which are also going to be discussed later on. And again, there are those who feed off of particular emotions like anger, grief, perhaps. This can, of course, be very complicated. This can, of course, be very painful, very disturbing to not just the people around the vampire, but also the vampire themselves, like I just cited in the example of my mother. Um, and this is not the reason why I am on poor footing or on poor terms, I should say, not footing. This is not why I'm on poor terms with my mother. That has little to nothing to do with it. It's just that she treated my sister, my father, and also myself like absolute garbage. That is the reason why we are not on good terms with each other, not because she happens to be a vampire. It is unfortunate that these experiences have gone down the way they have, but that is neither here nor there. I just wanted to cite it for the purpose of this video as an example. And lastly, I should say that there are also quote-unquote hybrids, which means that there are people who can go either for the sanguine feeding, feeding on blood, or who can sustain themselves off of the purely energetic extraction, like a psychic vampire or a true psychic vampire in that, or a vampire that would be classified as a psychic vampire would do. So that is also a thing that can occur if you are someone who could really not care less how they. So we then come to the topics of the topic of what kind of feeding is there. The most light form of feeding and the most environment friendly, I would call it in a ironic sense, would be what they call ambient feeding. It is, as the term implies, ambient is your surroundings, ambient is what is around you. And in other words, that means that a person who is an ambient feed, who applies ambient feeding, this is usually the kind of method that I instruct my own spirits to use when they feed, or when they gather energy for me, for myself or for someone else, when they are either in need of energy for some reason, or if I need to gather energy for a spell. I obviously don't want to intrude on other people's auras or their life force or whatever, so I basically just, ask them to go out and then gather energy from ambient sources, meaning to say that they will fly to, I don't know, a busy crowd somewhere, like a concert, a bar, a festival, a town square, a city center, what have you. And they will just basically pick up floating energy from around people. They're not actually intruding or protruding upon the aura or energy field of individuals. They're just picking up the stray energy that floats around and that people give off by default, by merely existing, by merely breathing, by yeah, by basically just doing human stuff. uh, or even from animals. I should not even say from humans, because there is also the capability of feeding off of animals, of course. This goes both for the psychic feeding as well as for the sanguine feeding. So that is the most environment-friendly, person-friendly, if you believe in karma-free method of feeding. And then there is the next level, tactile feeding, sometimes called surface feeding. It just draw directly from a person's aura, but it is really just from the surface. It's just like kind of like scraping off a little layer of it and then taking that energy and feeding off of it. So this is, yeah, some people could consider this kind of like a violation or a minor infraction. Personally, I wouldn't be too much of a fan of it without my personal consent. However, there's worse things under the sun or the moon or whatever. So, it is not invasive. That is one thing to keep in mind. It is therefore also not harmful. We then have a method which is sometimes referred to as deep feeding, and this is what qualifies as intrusive. So that means that if it is done on an unwilling host or an unwilling donor, as they sometimes call it. And this is done through sanguine methods, drinking blood, or through sexual contact. Now again, there is the concept of consent, the issue of consent, perhaps. Well, not perhaps. It is an issue of consent. From a moral and ethical perspective, you of course want to have consent from your donor or from the person you are feeding off of, to gather your energy in a morally sound manner, if you will, or in an ethical manner. Um, so it is a personal method. It creates stronger connections. So this method is the deepest method that you can probably attain, and of course the level of depth that you attain with this depends on a couple things, on how frequent you do it, whether the person gives consent, and how much consent they give, how much they allow you to do it, or how much you are forcing yourself upon the other person. So this can, of course, lead to very significant traumas and injuries, not just on the mental state of the individual, but also on the spiritual, subtle bodies of the individual in question. It is basically like somebody is taking you know, is taking a weapon to your aura and just stabbing holes in it, and then just sucking your energy out or something like that. It can be very violating if the person does not actually give consent on more levels than just the energetic. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, something I unfortunately have experience with on the giving end. Well, I wouldn't even really call it giving. Initially, it was giving with my first succubus, but it was later on, after I started having some seriously nasty experiences with her. It became very much non-consensual from my part, and she forced herself on me time and time again until, yeah, it was an unpleasant situation that lasted for a while, and fortunately is no longer the situation I find myself in. So that is a good thing. I mean, I personally would not have had an issue was it not the case that she kept interfering with my love life with physical women. So that is something that I, again, discuss in my Spirit Spouses Part 1 video. Because, I'm not someone who could exclusively be with a spirit spouse. I do want children at one point, for example, and I cannot have that with a spiritual spouse. So, that is something that my current succubus honors, fortunately, but the previous one did not, and there were a lot of other factors that made it a little more fucked up than it may seem at the surface, such as making my physical girlfriends ill, or contributing to it at least. And yeah, it was a complicated situation. So I think that may have also been part of the reason why the deities that I interacted with and made the deal with asked me to look into this, because it actually has a lot of correlation to my own situation in many ways. So, do keep in mind that certain deep feeding methods like sanguine feeding, like blood feeding, is, even though you may not physically be draining the hose dry or something, at least I would hope not, because then you would be engaging in certain illegal, illicit activities. Um, you really do need to be careful with diseases, obviously, as I hope that everybody understands. HIV is a problem, hepatitis is a problem, AIDS is a problem, So you do really need to, and many vampires, as I have understood from my research, do indeed do this. They try to seek consenting donors who are tested and screened and all that stuff, in order to have a safe partner to feed from, if you will. And by the way, these do not necessarily have to be lovers. When I say the word partner, it might just be a feeding partner. Which brings me to the next topic. So, who donates energy or blood or whatever to the vampire? So, according to my research, again, a preferred title or nickname that an individual like that usually seems to get is the Black Swan, which I found a strangely intimate and poetic nickname for some reason. I'm assuming that this comes from the association of the swan with love and beauty and that kind of stuff, romance in some cases. I know that the swan, for example, is a sacred symbol of Venus, the Roman goddess of love, of course. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was pretty endearing in a manner of speaking. And I mean that they're often portrayed to be very loyal, monogamous, I believe. So they can be, as I said, lovers, but they don't necessarily have to be. They can be close friends. They can be, family who may agree to be a consensual donor of energy or blood, even sometimes. So love obviously does not have to be romantic. I mean, there's platonic love, familial love, brotherly love, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that is basically who can be a safe donor for a vampire. Which then leads me to the next question: does one become a vampire? The answer to that is quite simple. You don't. You're apparently born as one, and that's the end of that. You don't become one from being bitten by one or sharing your blood with one. You don't become one through rituals. You don't become one uh, through any sort of other means. You don't find secret spells or potions or whatever the fuck you see in video games. Um, it just doesn't work like that. You are either one or you are not from birth. Whether you recognize it from an early age or not, that is more the question than anything else. And I think that maybe perhaps this later in life awakening um, is actually part of the reason why people get this idea in their heads that you can become a vampire. This is kind of parallel to what I personally have found from my shamanic initiation. But, when I was first told by another shaman that I was a shaman, as I said, did not have a clue what a shaman meant or what it was. I was fresh out of Christianity. I grew up in well, half atheist agnostic. My father was agnostic atheist, and my mom was a unbaptized Jehovah's Witness, meaning to say that she was raised in a Jehovah's Witness family but had never dedicated herself formally and officially to the religion. It's like a Catholic not receiving a baptism. They're not technically Catholics. So um, I was raised in a household like that with these two distinct, conflicting, perhaps, influences. I didn't know jack shit about shamans. The only thing that I knew of as a shaman was when I was playing World of Warcraft, and they were, I don't know, just people who did shit with elements stuff, and that was pretty much it. So, I mean, I had in passing read something about it here and there on the infamous Wikipedia, but that was about the extent of my knowledge. The point in case here, of course, is not knowing what it is does not make you one. Um, and it does not mean that the moment that you get told by someone else that you are it, uh, that you just suddenly became one and that you hadn't been one all along. So, in other words, the fact that that individual that told me that I was a shaman, and the you know the fact is this individual told me I was a shaman because I was already one before this individual and I met. It was just that this individual called my attention to it. Um, it didn't mean that I suddenly in that moment became a shaman. It merely meant that there was someone around to pinpoint it. And so too, I very strongly feel is this the case for a vampire who is unawakened. So someone who is a vampire and who is unawakened, they they very similarly have this going on. The fact that you don't know you're a vampire until you're in your mid 20s uh, doesn't not make you a vampire from the moment you were born, if that makes sense. the absence of knowledge does not make it untrue. So that is something to keep in mind, and I think that this is, again, where the myth of turning into a vampire or becoming a vampire comes from, or at least part of it. So that is something I would like to add there. It's a personal thought of mine, personal parallel, personal comparison that I felt the need to put out there. So that is often what happens. A person has an awakening, and they may have this happen due to extreme stress. They may have this happen due to someone else making them realize it. They may have an experience, and it can literally be, from what I have read online, be as simple as eating an extremely juicy burger, which I found quite entertaining. So it's, it varies from person to person. Just like every shaman, from what I have seen, has their own specialties, has their own initiation custom tailored to that particular shaman. So too do I feel and have seen, from what I have delved into this stuff for, from what I have noticed delving into this. So too does every vampire have their unique awakening. So you just realized, for whatever reason, or through whatever means, that you are indeed a vampire. Now, where do you turn? Because that may be a bit of a problem, right? I mean, again, to draw a parallel to my own shamanic initiation, um, I did not know where to turn. I had this individual that told me that I was a shaman, but eventually I also wanted to associate with other people who had similar experiences and who had, um, you know, their own issues that they were dealing with as part of this path that they walk on. And I wanted to connect to other beings, and I have not really met anybody that has had quite the experiences like I have, but that is not really the point that I'm trying to make here. The point is, it is natural to want to seek out, companionship, camaraderie, to seek out people who are, wanting to engage with you, who will recognize you for who and what you are, and who will accept you for your, well, very nature, really. And I would suggest to you to go read some books, perhaps uh, from the authors that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. They seem to have a great selection of books to read. I have not read all of them, but from what I have gathered, they are a great writer in that department. You could go online on forums. There seem to be dedicated online communities for this kind of event. Being someone who is into light BDSM myself, there is a subgroup of, you know, kinksters out there who like this particular kind of activity. So, if you wish, you can probably find some kindred souls that way. And especially if you are someone perhaps who, if you like to engage in, safe, consensual blood play, of course, safe and consensual being keywords there. These are all ways in which you can try to connect with other vampiric individuals in a healthy, conducive manner. Of course, healthy, conducive, safety, these are all keywords that I cannot reiterate enough. Um, because, it can be a rough world out there. Always be careful who you trust, of course. Don't open up too quickly. Make sure that you trust individuals before you engage with them on certain things, especially if it involves sanguinary activities. That is, of course, a major risk for your health that can potentially influence your entire life. And that is something you really don't want. I mean, being a vampire does not make you immune to all sorts of nasty illnesses, as we have discussed. You are still a regular human being in every other aspect of your existence. And to think otherwise is a bit naive. I mean, I hold no illusions that just because someone called me a shaman and I happen to take that path on, that I'm somehow a superhuman individual in the flesh that can lift 10 tons of, steel with my mind or something like that. It just doesn't work like that. I very strongly believe in the powers of magic. I have seen it in my personal life. I've seen it manifest on others around me, very strongly so. And yeah, no, it is definitely real from what I have seen. From what I've experienced, there's no doubt in my mind, but that does not mean that I somehow see myself as an invincible superhuman who is impervious to certain human conditions, because I am also aware that I am incarnated as a human being, and so are you. So, yeah, that is a friendly wake up call from your local jackass over here. So, I believe that the book that I cited in the beginning, the Psychic Vampire Codex, in its Appendix 1, all the way at the back of that book, has a list of organizations which you can join, which you can look into, which you can perhaps contact if you so desire. So that might be worth checking out. Again, as I stated at the beginning of this video, I am not in any way, shape, or form affiliated with any of the aforementioned individuals and or websites, etc., etc. They don't pay me. I don't owe them nothing. They don't owe me nothing. It's helped me in my research to accomplish the task that was set out for me. So that is what I am grateful for, and that's why I'm putting these resources out to you as a nice, starter starter pack way of starting your journey, I suppose, if you are watching this. So you will also meet, different clans, or read about different clans that way, and they all have their own ideas, philosophies, maybe even religious, spiritual beliefs. They may adhere to different creeds and codes, and basically there are plenty of them out there. And if you wish, there's probably a group or two out there that will mostly or entirely fit your particular criteria that you have for joining, as long as you, of course, also fit theirs for wanting to have you as a member of their fold. So, which then brings me to the topic of vampiric magic, which is actually usually the part that I find the most fascinating. I mean, I'm an avid practitioner of the magical arts, of the metaphysical arts. So it is a topic that is kind of on my bucket list to more thoroughly delve into, to more thoroughly study, to more thoroughly analyze and practice with. So I will not be giving you a very convoluted, very in-depth rundown of what it entails specifically. Of course, what I can say is that it seems to deal a lot with energy manipulation, shielding, grounding, stabilizing of the energies. A lot of it deals with and relates to the archetype of the vampire, of course, with such symbolism being used in ritual. If that speaks to your mind, if that speaks to your subconscious, that can be, of course, a very powerful thing, because magic is all about intent, as those who practice probably very well know. That's why the runes are my tool of choice. I've always, since I was a young boy, had a fascination with the Germanic, Norse mythologies, with the gods and goddesses of my ancestors, basically my very distant ancestors, of course, because my most recent ancestors were all Christian. But that is a topic for another time. But I mean, it is something that is a very powerful tool in magic. Vampiric magic can, in some ways, be as simple as just using the symbolism for occult purposes. So, I mean, you will see symbols like the Ankh, which, the Egyptian symbol for the life force and stuff like that. The septagram, the seven-pointed star, stuff like that is something that you will often find in symbolism relating to vampirism, vampiric magic. In a more practical sense, vampiric magic could, of course, be relating to manipulation of energy in order to draw energy out of another person in order to feed or sustain yourself or to empower yourself, perhaps temporarily, usually temporarily, I would say. Of course, the ethics and methods of this would be a little more questionable depending on whether the individual has given consent or not. So do please, keep that in mind. Um, or it can even be to shield oneself against such attacks or such drainage from an opposing party, if you will. But again, I would very much like to delve more deeply into this particular topic of vampiric magic in general before I start making a very dedicated video on that particular topic. So I am likely, no guarantees here, but likely, if I have the time and the research material available, will be delving into that particular branch and strand of magic for those of you so inclined and who are interested in that particular topic. So yeah, that pretty much concludes all I had to say for this particular topic, for this particular video on the basically the 101 on vampirism. Thank you all for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time on whatever video I upload next. Hell.